Okay, so we are online.
Okay, welcome everybody. It is a great pleasure to have with us today Dr. Philipp Frank, who is visiting us from MPA, Torsten Ensling's group. So Philipp has obtained his bachelor and PhD degree from LMU, Munich. And he did his PhD research at MPA, where he's currently holding his first postdoc. And then he will talk to us about signal reconstruction for fields using full techniques. So without any further ado, Philipp, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Vaso. Thank you. Yeah, thank you all for having me here. It has been a lot of fun so far. So the Freddo Espresso and the sunny side of Crete had been amazing. Now I also have to deliver some work to you guys to make up for it. Yes, so I want to talk a little bit about signal reconstruction for fields. So basically how we approach reconstruction problems that arise in various kinds of observational astronomy, ranging from radio interferometry over X-ray, gamma ray imaging, but also ISM tomography. And yes, so the common denominator for us is fields. So essentially, the quantities that we're interested in are functions of space or functions of space and time or space-time and frequency, whatever, like density fields, the brightness distribution on the sky coming to us to the detector. These kinds of objects are the quantities that we're interested in and that we want to reconstruct. And my talk will broadly be structured as following. Essentially, I want to start with the why. So why bother with fields? Why even go through the extent of reconstructing fields when we're interested in maybe only a few specific estimators? I want to talk a little bit about probabilistic reasoning, why this is the method of choice for us, and also forward modeling, why this becomes useful to us. There are many other ways to do these things. I'm just going to present what we do in our group and what I've been doing over the past years, and maybe something useful is here also for one of you guys. Well, then after the why comes the how. How do we actually do this? I wanted to talk a little bit about generative models, Gaussian processes, then very, very briefly about how the concept of likelihoods and instrument models enter the game. And then finally, how to actually solve these problems on a computer, how to actually do approximate inference on a computer numerically. And to make it not too dry and boring, there's also going to be a lot of what are we actually doing? And I'm going to show some examples from, yeah, as I said, radio interferometry. I have a small example from Faraday tomography, 3D dust tomography using Gaia, and then some X-ray and gamma ray imaging. And because the how and the why might be a bit too dry on its own, I'm not going to completely follow this chronologically, but the what will always be jump in from time to time in between. So whenever there's a pretty picture on the site, like this one here, that's the latest reconstruction from a supernova remnant from Chandra data that we did. If you are bored by what's on the left-hand side of the talk, at least there might be a pretty picture on the right-hand side to look at. That's as far as I can assure. So yeah, let me start with the why. Why fields. Here you can see a video of the 3D reconstruction of galactic dust, or better to say extinction from dust as measured by Gaia and reconstructed from Gaia data. And that is in the very local vicinity around a few hundred parsecs around the sun. And so why are these quantities interesting? Why do we care? Why do we go through the effort of reconstructing them? Aside from, well, it's a very pretty video and nice to look at, I also want to make a few cases of why it could be interesting to make the effort of reconstructing a whole field and not just individual estimators, and then derive estimators from these fields instead. It is an effort to do these things. I want to say this right from the beginning. The very latest dust map I will show it towards the end, now features on the order of 0.8 billion degrees of freedoms that have to be recovered, and it uses around 100 million data points from the Gaia catalog, which is still not everything that Gaia has to offer. So these are massive computational problems to be solved, and it's not a trivial thing to do. So we have to justify why these efforts are necessary. So let me start with very basic thing, what we always all want to do. When we have observational data, essentially at the end of the day, we want to answer questions. We want to do science. Maybe these are the questions that we wrote down in the proposal in the first place to get the money to obtain the data. Maybe these were questions that arose along the way, but at the end of the day, that's why we make observations, to answer new science questions. In reality, usually we cannot get away with a definite answer. The best we can hope for is estimators based on the data, essentially because our data will always be noisy and incomplete, and only by combining it with some assumptions, we arrive at estimators for our answers. So I'm trying to follow this notation of questions being functions Q and answers being A's. If not somewhere, then excuse my sloppy notation. Right, so maybe make this a bit more specific. Let's say we have Gaia data and we're interested in what's the spatial power spectrum of dust. That's a valid question to answer. And Gaia data the Gaia extinction data has this information in, but from the data directly, it's very non-trivial to ask how do we arrive at the spatial power spectrum of dust. If we have already the 3D dust distribution, as you saw in the video before, if let's say this cube magically appeared, then it's very straightforward to answer such questions, right? We can just, it's a very simple exercise. If I give you a cube, calculate the power spectrum of a 3D cube that was reconstructed. And then here on the right, you can see the recovered power spectrum from that cube, and also the spatial correlation kernel, which is essentially the Fourier transform of this. We can also ask other questions, like what's the distance between the Perseus and the Taurus regions? It's unfortunately a bit hard to see, but up here is the Planck data in Planck dust data, and here you can see in blue the Taurus and in red the Perseus region, and on the sky they appear very nearby. And a valid question to ask is, how close are they together actually in 3D space? And well, once again, Gaia has that information from the data directly. It's not that easy to determine that, but once we have a 3D dust map, it's a very straightforward thing. We just look in the 3D cube, where's Perseus and where's Taurus, and here actually color coded. Fortunately, it's a bit cut away, but the blue stuff is essentially closer to us than the red stuff. And I think if I get the numbers right here, the blue region is roughly 100 to 120 parsec away from us, and the red region goes up to 320 parsec from the sun. So even though they appear nearby in the sky, they're actually quite far separated in distance. And again, once we have the 3D dust map, these are very trivial questions to be answered. So essentially generalizing this idea a bit, if I have a complete description of my system, and I will call this signal, then answering questions given that signal is fairly straightforward. It's essentially just have a question, how far are these two objects away from each other? If I have specified what these objects are by defining whatever the system is, in this case, I need to know something about the density of dust and the temperature of dust to transform extinction density to number density, essentially. And then these questions can be readily answered. So, and that's the underlying idea of signal-based inference. Rather than trying to build a specific estimator for one particular question, we try to recover a more or less discrete, complete description of the system, reconstruct this, which is going to be an effort, but this is an effort once, and then we can ask questions to that system later. And if this is done consistently and probabilistically, these estimators that are derived from the recovered signal will be consistent with what the data would have given you. That's basically the takeaway message. There's one issue with that. We don't have the signal, right? We only have the data, and we can never recover a perfect knowledge of the signal unless in very extreme trivial cases. In all realistic cases, the best we can hope for is probabilistic estimates. So rather than saying, I know what the signal is and I answer my question by just computing it, I will have infinitely many possible signals. I will have a whole distribution over signals that are plausible given the observed data and given my model assumptions. And this is what probabilistic or Bayesian estimators end up looking like. I try to recover the probability distribution of my signal, of my description of my system, given the data and model assumptions. And then estimators are computed by averaging the answers to questions over all possible states that can occur a posteriori. To give you a visual example, here is something where we applied this to the 2017 EHT data. I think you've all seen this or a similar image, although this is actually a video of the entire week of observations that were done. This data set was, from the perspective of being used to radio interferometric data, was horribly bad. I mean, it's an amazing effort what EHT did and the fact that this even exists. But in terms of what comes out of an interferometer, of a classic interferometer, this data set was very, very weakly constraining. And we can see this here, that even the mean video, so this is basically our estimator for the sky brightness distribution over the course of this week. This is an average or an integral over all these possible videos over here. Here are 16 examples, but there are infinitely many. And there is quite a significant variability in all of them. Nevertheless, all of them are consistent with the observational data. And that is what gives you an idea of how probabilistic estimators work. So these are all possible black hole shadows that could have been that could be consistent with what the 2017 EHT data tells you. And if I would have to make a best guess, if I would have to make one guess, then it will be their average, which essentially is what I communicate. And of course, uncertainties around this can be estimated in the same way, or any other estimators. We will get to that later. But okay. Try to share again. Okay. So you can see me. You can see my screen again, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, perfect. Yeah, I'm sorry. It maybe I'm connected via Eduroam here. I don't know how stable the connection is. All right. Yes, so we've translated our problem from getting estimators from data to recovering an entire probability distribution over signals, over a complete description of our system, which sounds a lot more complicated than the initial estimator. However, this posterior distribution we can decompose in a way to make it more accessible. So essentially by making use of probability theory, of the rules of probability theory, rather than factorizing in our signal, our, let's say, the dust density distribution given the data, we can factorize this joint distribution the other way around, which is just using the product rule of probabilities, nothing more. And then we get two probabilities. One is basically the probability of the observed data given the signal, which is called likelihood, and the probability of the signal itself without the data, which is often termed prior knowledge, essentially knowledge that we have on the system without having seen the data. These are quantities that are much more accessible, right? And it's much easier to reason over how did the data arose from a given signal sky configuration, rather than the other way around. This is very complicated. Asking what plausible dust distributions are compatible with the Gaia data, that's a question that's very unintuitive for us to answer. But given this distribution of dust in the ISM, what would Gaia see if we were to conduct a measurement? That's a question we can answer. We can try to understand the mechanisms of Gaia and how this telescope works, or any other telescope. But these are mechanisms that we can understand, that we can simulate and build. So this is a quantity that's much more accessible rather than the posterior directive. And similar for the prior, reasoning about what properties of dust we know a priori is something that's much easier to do than reasoning about the posterior directive. So that's essentially everything there is to say to Bayesian estimators and to the why of it, because now we've translated the question of getting answers to questions generically to, well, we have to build a description of how our telescope works, and we have to specify what do we believe is true about the sky a priori, and then we can readily answer questions. And there's no extra assumptions or informations that have to go in. Everything is down here. Everything is encoded in the likelihood and the prior. So that brings me to the how. Now we've established the why, and
so you consider that the
yes.
Sorry to interrupt, but
Sure,
so you
sure.
consider that the optimization has no importance.
The optimization. Oh, I haven't talked about how to
No,
solve
because you
this.
said that everything is in the data and the model, and so the optimization has no importance at all in the process.
I haven't talked about how to solve this in practice yet. At the moment, I mean, this is a self-consistent description, and there's no optimization in theory happening. In practice, of course, in order to solve these integrals, I have to do some numerical optimization, and this has an effect, and I will get to that when we get to the how. But on a principle, on a fundamental level, the numerical optimization does not enter my description of the telescope, nor does it enter the description of what I believe about the sky. That's my take on it.
Yeah, well, in practice, if the problem is non-convex, so the optimization technique is fundamental in order to get a good solution, right? So
and I will get to this. I will get to this later. But I would make the separation. It might be arguably it might be a academic distinction where to put this. I fully agree. But I think on this level, at least, it's conceptually clear to have this separation. But I agree. In the end, it's a matter of choice. And yeah, we'll get to optimization in a minute. But very good, very excellent point. Once we actually have to do this in practice, there will be more coming in. Right. So, yeah, sorry if I forgot to say that in the beginning. Whenever you have questions, please feel free to ask and feel free to interrupt me. And if I'm going too fast over something or too slow over something and you all fall asleep, please let me know and I'll adapt. Right. So we arrived at the how. How do we do these things? So I want to briefly focus on the likelihood, very, very briefly. I will not talk too much about instrument models because that's really specific to the problem that you're dealing with at hand, but just to give you an overview of what typically enters into describing description of a likelihood. First of all, there's the relation of the signal, the thing that you've defined to be your system, to the actual observable that arrives in your detector. For example, we don't observe the 3D dust distribution directly. What we observe is line of sight intervals of starlight that gets absorbed in Gaia. So essentially, translating the extinction density to the absorption that is measured by Gaia. This is encoded in this relation, and then there are instrumental effects like the geometry of your detector, exposures, point spread functions, various noise processes that can enter there, calibration. All these things enter in a description of the instrument and enter in the likelihood, and they are subject to assumptions ultimately. Usually, maybe from a theorist perspective, we say, okay, yeah, we understand our detector, and then the more you talk to the person that actually built the detector, the less convinced you get about all these things that are unclear and complicated, and it gets very, very messy. So ultimately, also here are assumptions involved, but usually these assumptions are much easier to grasp and to test, because we can at least partially test them at the detector. Just as an example, over here I brought that's the point spread function of the Rosetta telescope, which is essentially has a very nice, it's unfortunately a bit difficult to see, but it has a very nice spatially and also spectral variability. And incorporating this properly and is a non-trivial task, and also the more accurate one gets in the instrument description, the better the reconstructions are. That's fairly clear. I want to focus a little more on the other part, on the prior, because there we've developed quite a number of techniques to deal with priors for fields, for functions, and one of the key ingredients for this are so-called Gaussian processes. And Gaussian processes are very, very simple prior models. These are essentially the extension of Gaussians as you know them to functions. So one can assign also Gaussian distributions essentially to functions, to infinite dimensional quantities, and they are fully described by their mean field, so by their 1 and 2 point correlation function. It's completely analogous to Gaussians, just the extension that now everything are functions. And the mean field, I won't focus too much on for the moment. I will mostly focus on the correlation structure, on the correlation function, because this encodes how correlated a priori things are in space or in space and time. And this can be used very efficiently to encode prior knowledge on the system. Just for completeness, here's the formula, but it's not really relevant, so I will skip over it very fast and show you some examples. So here's a very, very simple 2D statistically homogeneous and isotropic Gaussian process. This is how a random realization of this looks like. So basically, I specify a 2-point correlation function to be some power law like kernel, and then draw random numbers, a random function that respects this distribution. And it looks something like this. Gaussian processes are neat in the sense that they can be stacked and also extended, in the sense that we can make Gaussian processes a multi-stage problem in the sense that rather than saying, okay, I have a fixed given power spectrum, I have a fixed given correlation structure, I make the correlation structure itself also a function that is unknown, and I also put a Gaussian process on this. So essentially, I make it a 2-stage process. I first generate the power spectrum, and then conditional to that power spectrum, I generate random realizations. This gives me something like this, if we look at that. So here are then power spectra themselves being generated as functions, and then for each of those power spectra, I can generate 2D random processes, and they will have different statistical properties.
But in terms of generative models, so there is a lot of activities in the field, in the literature now, and many based on neural networks, and also using new techniques like scattering transform. So Stefan Mala is giving a talk on Friday here. But then I have the feeling that these new techniques can model much more complicated images than stationary process as you are doing here.
I will get to
I guess you cannot have a galaxy here.
I will get to non-stationary processes in a minute.
You can model a galaxy?
Yes.
You can generate a galaxy?
Yeah, I will get to this in a second.
Interesting.
Because so there's one important thing to consider here. It's essentially the power of inverse transform sampling, or the power of reparameterizations, in the sense that in the correct coordinate frame, everything can look like a Gaussian. So it doesn't necessarily have to be the coordinate frame of the galaxy where you generate a Gaussian process. You can generate a Gaussian process in a different coordinate system and then apply transformations to it.
Okay, can you repeat this?
Any probability distribution, any proper probability distribution can be mapped to a Gaussian distribution by means of so-called inverse transform sampling. And this also extends to infinite dimensions. So the coordinate frame in which Gaussian processes are realized does not necessarily have to be the coordinate frame in which the observables are defined. So I can generate a Gaussian process and then apply a coordinate transformation to it to get something very, very complicated. I would say the prime example is the large-scale structure of the universe. We take initial conditions, Gaussian random field, and then apply a very, very complicated transformation to it, which is essentially cosmological evolution. And then we get something very non-Gaussian, very structured. The transformation in between is very complicated. It's basically running a full numerical simulation.
I guess that this is true for any process.
Yes.
Any distribution, you can always change it to go to something else. Like
any proper distribution. Yes. Right. So, however, and that's the important point. In many cases, even such simple examples can already suffice to give enough constraints to solve problems in practice. Like, for example, in the EHT example that I showed here, was the stationary process used in space and also one in time. So the main addition here was we used the product of what you just saw and saying, okay, there's one stationary process in 2D space, there's a stationary process in time, and both of them are unknown and will be constrained by the data. And this together gives something that is flexible, yet constraining enough to solve problems in practice. And that is also a very, now we're already getting into the philosophical discussions of prior models, but how useful or useless a prior is depends on what estimators, what quantities you want to look at in the end. A prior doesn't necessarily have to be a complete description of your system. You don't have to simulate a galaxy in order to reconstruct the local dust distribution, because the data will be very constraining on many things. What you need is the few, let's say, orthogonal dimensions, the few orthogonal properties that are not well constrained by data, and have a prior that makes reasonable assumptions about these degrees of freedom. But for example, let's say I'm very, very uninterested in the absolute amount of dust in my cube. I don't need a prior that tells me anything about this, because the Gaia data will completely constrain me this. Also, the large-scale structure of the dust will be very, very constrained by the data, simply because the data is so good. So depending on what quantities one is interested in, one does not have to include all knowledge that exists into a useful prior model. That really depends on what estimators you want to look at in the end. And that's an important part to study, and that's also an active, so quantifying this properly is an active field of studying to say how influential is a certain prior choice and what would happen to my estimators if I would change certain prior assumptions or adapt certain prior assumptions. But I would argue it's not necessarily, it is of course desirable if I can. If I can simulate galaxies perfectly without any effort, sure, that's a very good prior model to use. But it's not a necessity to get a decent 3D reconstruction of local dust. That's an important point to make. So let me extend this a little bit. Coming back to Gaussian processes and making them non-stationary. As usual, if you have a simple model, you can make it complicated by stacking them on top of each other. Here's the most trivial thing of stacking things on top of each other by taking one stationary process and basically using it as the exponential of it as a screen for the other one. So by multiplying these two together, you get something which has non-stationary properties in the sense that it will be stronger. Its amplitude will be stronger in regions where this field is larger and smaller in regions where this field is smaller. The same can be done with the correlation length. So I can randomly generate one field and saying this should set my length scale for the correlation function of the second one, and thereby creating non-stationary processes. And with combining these things, one can get very, very expressive and complicated structures. So in terms of expressiveness, I'm not really worried here. What's the challenge here is keeping this computationally cheap. So generating these things in linear time such that we don't run out of compute time in order to do so. And this is just one little point I wanted to make where we have made some nice advancements in the past. So here's again just examples of a stationary random process. The difference is though these panels were not generated on the same computational grid. So only the top panel was done on a regular grid where it's very easy to generate stationary processes. This one was done on a polar grid with logarithmic radial binning, and this one was done on some differentially rotated grid. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that even though they all resemble statistically homogeneous processes, they were generated on very irregular coordinate frames, which makes it extremely flexible to work with in practice. Right, so that's so far on prior models. Let's get back to solving problems, and let's get back to how can we actually, once we've defined our prior, once we've defined our likelihood, we can set up our posterior. How can we actually solve these integrals in practice? Because there's some work to be done here. And the method of choice for us is what we call variational inference or approximate variational inference, where we essentially replace the posterior distribution with a different one, an approximation, one where we can compute integrals over, and then try to estimate and try to minimize the Kullback-Leibler divergence between these two. So that is essentially the take-home message here. We take the Kullback-Leibler divergence, which is essentially a measure for similarity of probability distributions. And we choose a family of distributions, of approximate distributions, which I don't know why I keep getting. Okay. Right. Yeah, so this is where we were just talking about this before. This is where essentially a second part of model assumptions enters by choosing a family of distributions. One also makes an assumption about what things to consider. The method of choice for us is what's called geometric variational inference. That's essentially a variational inference algorithm that can adapt to nonlinear geometries of posterior distributions. So here's some cartoonish example of how this approximation works. If this colored regime is the actual true posterior distribution, then the approximate one, which are the blue dashed lines here, is essentially moved and morphed towards the true posterior distribution until it approximates the true one fairly well. And the important point of this method is that it works in very high dimensions and still efficient enough to do reconstructions in, for example, the 800 million dimensional problem of dust tomography, which is not non-trivial thing to do. Internally, it essentially works by doing coordinate transformations again. So if there's a non-Gaussian curved posterior landscape, then the algorithm essentially infers a coordinate transformation. It's somewhat similar to a normalizing flow, with the difference that it's using the geometric structure of the posterior itself in order to construct this transformation, and then approximates with a Gaussian in this transform space. That's the approximation here. Right. So this is all there is to do about the how and the why. So we can finally arrive at the what and see some pictures for the last few minutes. We've already seen this one. We've already seen the application to EHT. Here's it once more. On the top left, we have the posterior mean. On the top right, the posterior uncertainty. And then on the bottom left, there's a saturated version of it, and next to it, the one that was recovered by the EHT collaboration. The main important finding that we got is that we were largely consistent with what the EHT people found. That was reassuring. There was no on the ring itself, there was nothing significant that was considered different from what the EHT collaboration published for the individual days. What I personally found very striking in this problem was that it was a really there was really little data to work with. So in the end, we worked with so-called closure quantities to do the reconstruction, which are basically a data product that can be derived from interferometric data that's invariant under certain calibration artifacts. And it amounted to only a few hundred data points, literal data points in the UV plane or closure quantities for each of the individual days, and only 4 days of the 7 days were observed, the first 2 and the last 2. So this is a really small data set from which we aim to reconstruct the entire distribution, brightness distribution for that week. And I thought it personally quite amazing that first of all, even a ring came out that was unclear for also for the EHT collaboration, given that there's no assumption on ring-like structure or anything put in. It's a stationary process in space and time. There's no reason why this should come out like that. So that was quite nice to see. And this was also a very persistent result for us. We tried many different configurations and did many runs, and this was a really stable result in the end, which we were very happy about. And also numerically, we ended up being more or less consistent with what EHT found. Our ring was slightly thicker than theirs, but everything within the 2 sigma interval of each other. But aside from that, the brightness asymmetry, the orientation angle of the bright spot, you saw this this wandering of this bright spot over the course of the 7 days, slightly to the lower right. This was all more or less consistent with what HT found. Exactly. So moving on, keeping in the radio regime, but going to Faraday tomography. Here's our latest reconstruction of the line of sight averaged line of sight component of the galactic magnetic field, as you can recover from the Faraday sky. This one is from the perspective of the person that is building reconstruction algorithms. That was an interesting problem because this has done many iterations and has grown in complexity over the years, and now features a variety of different data sets from different origins that were combined. So it has the rotation measures for the Faraday sky. It has pulsar data for the dispersion measures, which essentially traces the line of sight integral of the electron density. And it also uses thermal emission measure data, which is essentially a tracer for the line of sight integral of the electron density squared, as coming, for example, from the Frank free data. And all of these data sets were combined to reconstruct not one, but 3 all-sky fields simultaneously in a joint run. So this entire forward model and these entire data sets were all jointly reconstructed. And we get then 3 different components. One is the one that we assign to the magnetic field. And then there's the one basically assigned to the dispersion measure here on logarithmic scales. And ultimately is essentially the fractional dispersion over emission measure, which is the 3rd component, that when you take these 3 together, you can essentially generate all the things that are observed by the data set. And this was interesting because it's in this computational graph, all these things talk to each other directly or indirectly. So while the dispersion measure directly influences all the observables, changing this one has essentially an effect onto this one indirectly, because their product or their combination has to be consistent with the data, which in turn can have an effect also on this one. So keeping track of all the correlations and couplings of all these things, which are nonlinear, is an effort, and is not a trivial inference task. So that was interesting to see that this works out fairly well. Then yeah, let's move on to dust tomography. So that is the very latest dust map that we produced. This is an animation showing posterior samples to give you an idea of the uncertainties that are also still within the reconstructed map. So as you can see, the central region is very, very fixed. So that's essentially because the Gaia data there is so good that there's hardly any variation to be seen on the on these scales. However, the further we go out, the map quickly decreases in quality, and there we can see some significant residual uncertainties, which are important to track in order to make sure that we don't wrongly assign dust clouds or locations to dust clouds. What was an interesting result for us to see is that this map, for the first time, was large enough for us to track and compare it to YSO clusters. So these are basically clusters of young stars, which are still assumed to be young enough to reside in dense regions where they were born, essentially, and haven't traveled out too far yet. And at least visually, the comparison is quite good, and that was a surprisingly interesting result to me personally, because this was not at all clear a priori that this would be such a match. It's also interesting is to look at all-sky projections, but now sliced in depth. So this is basically the dust integrated up to 250 parsec from us. This is basically starting at 250 parsec up to 500 parsec, and then successively going further out. And what's interesting to see here is that essentially all the high latitude things are nearby, which is something that we know, but it's also here a very obvious thing to see. If we go far enough away from us, essentially all structures that we can see are only left in the plane because they're too far away. Right, moving on. We've seen this one before. That's Chandra X-ray imaging. Here the essential challenge is well, okay, the data is actually very good. Not very. The beamer is not, but the data is. But the challenge here is that we didn't just reconstruct the one image. What we reconstructed was actually two. One, if you can see here, the point sources disappearing. So one was basically taking care of the diffuse emission, and the other one was taking care of only the point sources. So these two components together make up the sky. The separation is not perfect. There's still some spots, some bright spots where essentially there are remnants of the point spread function that imprint into the diffuse emission, but most of the structures are gone and end up in the stars, in the point source like component. A similar preliminary result I wanted to show for Rosita, because that's the latest thing that this team has been working on. This was the first light image published by the Rosita collaboration, and we also applied essentially the techniques that I just showed for Chandra to the Rosita data set, and we get basically a sharpened up and better decomposed version of what was initially published by the Rosita collaboration. So all in all, also in this case, the techniques seem to work and seem to do a decent job in terms of, again, also not a perfect one, but this is largely due to effects in the PSF of Rosita that are not well modeled yet. So the Rosita PSF there's still a lot to be studied, and the Chandra PSF is a lot better understood already. So these are, let me come to the final and go to final example and go up all the way to gamma rays. So then we've basically walked through the whole spectrum. Here's the raw Fermi gamma ray data. And also here we've basically done a decomposition and reconstruction. And this is what's left of the sky after basically removing the Poissonian shock noise. Also this one was decomposed into a point source like component, a diffuse component, and the diffuse component itself, because it's also spectrally resolved, was further decomposed into a soft and a hard component. So basically having the soft component was partially informed by a dust template. So this basically is the soft part of the spectrum that gets picked up here, and then the harder spectrum ends up in this second component. And then for the conclusion, let me basically wrap up and say just few more points on estimators and my take on them. So the essential point that I wanted to make is so estimators can just be functions of data and model assumptions, and it's depending on the task at hand, trying to construct these functions directly, maybe the method of choice. However, one can go one step further once one introduces the concept of a signal, once one introduces the concept of latent variable models, or however you want to call them, basically describing what your system is. One can then turn the problem of finding an estimator to the problem of finding a posterior distribution, and then try to construct this one. Or one can go even one step further and say this posterior distribution I can look at in terms of a prior and a likelihood, and then try to formulate the problem in terms of these components. And depending on your problem, I would say either of these approaches is the way to go. There's a lot of modern day machine learning going on in partially replacing parts in here with neural networks, essentially, either modeling this entire thing as a neural network. If I have enough data answer pairs to train on, that's a very good way to go. Maybe I have a good description of the instrument model and I have a lot of numerical simulations on my system, then training an emulator that gives me a prior model is a way to go. People have been very successful recently with inference networks. So basically, once I have enough signal and data pairs, trying to build a neural network that can directly parameterize the posterior distribution. Also, this is very successful work. But I still think that the full model-based approach, where one has full control over the ingredients and knows what they are, will also always have its merits. And then ultimately, if you're dealing with fields, this combination of Gaussian and generative processes and geometric variation inference could be a very powerful tool. And if you want to play around with it and trying out, here's the code repository where essentially all of these methods are implemented, and it's publicly available. And also for most of the reconstruction that I've showed you the code of how they were done, and basically the ingredients of how the telescope was modeled and so on and so forth is also all public. So if you want to take a look at that, feel free to. And if you have any questions, comments, I'm open for them now and tomorrow, but then I will leave. So better be quick about it. Thank you.
Questions for Philipp now? Perhaps somebody from the Zoom?
I don't see anybody yet, but anyone wants to ask a question, raise your hand or maybe ask directly.
If somebody asks a question, I already asked many questions during the talk, so let's continue.
No, please.
Okay, the first one is so the whole computer science community, applied math community, they're all doing inverse programming using machine learning and neural network, right? So it's completely a huge trend in this direction. So here you were considering more, I would say, standard techniques, more in the old Bayesian fashion. While now people in computer science they may keep the Bayesian framework, but everything will be based on neural network, right? They derive the posterior from neural networks. They will use the Langevin dynamic to find the posterior and all the kind of things. They will use this kind of technique. So in what you are doing, do you believe that you can be competitive with what people are doing in the computer science domain, or?
Yes, absolutely. So the main
make some comparison somewhere or some papers or
let me see if we have a direct comparison. So the main issue with the main current issue with completely, I would happily remove basically this step and replace it with a neural network in a let's say closed form black box way, if that would be good enough and feasible. And from everything that we've tried so far, it is not yet there. Essentially in terms of scale. So
for instance, MRI imaging, which are quite complicated imaging of the brain or kind of thing, they are completely in the deep learning techniques, for instance.
Exactly. But
and even if they want to have the posterior, they use the score matching technique. They are really in the Bayesian framework and they have the whole posterior as well.
It's simply so if you try to do this on the scale of what's necessary for Gaia, for example, if you try to do this in the scale of a billion pixel.
In MRI imaging, are much more than that. It's 4D data, functional MRI,
So all I've seen does not get enough quality for these reconstructions. So I happily they do work in a traditional way. They have a big Hamiltonian Monte Carlo sampler to get basically large scale structure distribution, and also there it seems very challenging for now to get these methods to converge accurate enough. But hopefully this will change in the future because I would love to. At the moment, I don't see them having enough quality, and I think what may be a difference for MRI is that training data landscape is so much better there. I think there it's much easier to get large scale, good high quality data sets to train on. For example, for the galactic magnetic field or dust component, it's very difficult to get training data of the quality that would be required to be on that scale. So maybe it's just that. Maybe the methods are there, but the data is not yet. But also this will only be a matter of time. But for the moment, and I think also depending on the problem, but I think there will be, if you are in this very exploratory regime where it's very hard to actually simulate the system down to a level of let's say detail that's required to really train a network, an end-to-end black box network. I think there will always be a certain amount of hands-on modeling remaining necessary, and being basically somewhere in between and having both tools at hand is the way to go. That's my personal take on it.
Other questions? Anybody? Online or offline?
We have one from Vincent.
Yes.
Do you want to say yourself, Vincent, or I read it for you? You okay? So Vincent Pelgrims says, "Hi Philip, great talk. Could you talk a little bit more about the geometric variational inference? What's the purpose of it? What problems does it solve?"
Sure. Let me see. I have 1 second. Yeah, I think these slides are the best explanatory ones. So the main problem to solve is approximating posterior distributions which are non-Gaussian. So essentially in these very high dimensional fields like inference problems, the biggest issue with posterior distributions tends to be non-Gaussianity. So there are basically in high dimensions very squeezed or curved part of your posterior, which are geometrically hard to access. Multimodality is not so much an issue, or it seems to be not so much an issue in practice in many cases. I think the reason is mostly that the posterior still remains unimodal. It just becomes very deformed in this high dimensional space and lies close to some some low-dimensional manifold. So in order to track this geometry, what's happening in geometric variation of inference essentially is that a notion of metric, a notion of distance and curvature is built from the Fisher information metric of the problem.
I think you don't show your screen.
I don't share my screen. Sorry about that. Sorry, Vincent. No. Yes, very good. Yes, so what's essentially happening is that this posterior metric built from the Fisher information metric is used to get a notion of curvature in that posterior landscape. So basically, it gives you at every point in space, it gives you a notion of how curved things are, and from these local coordinate frames, which at every point tell you basically how things change, one can construct a coordinate system. And this coordinate system is essentially it's a so-called Riemann coordinate frame. So it depends on it's a Riemann coordinate system based around one expansion point. And this coordinate frame is then used to transform the posterior into a space where it looks much more Gaussian. And then this is where things get approximated with a Gaussian, and then by transforming this essentially the Gaussian from that space back into the original space, one gets an approximate posterior distribution, and that's the full cycle of GeoVI. And the main purpose of this is to solve integrals, which involve the actual posterior distribution. So this one. And replace those with basically this approximation, which can be accessed analytically, or which at least can be sampled from easily to replace the integrals with sample averages.
Is this approximation accounted later on from the in the posteriors that you draw for your simulations, or meaning that if this the errors in the approximation are propagated later on, or they are taken as optimal and that's it?
They are taken as optimal. What we do is we test for in estimators, what we can do is test for their impact. So propagating these errors is as complicated as solving the full problem, which makes it. But what we can get is a bound on this error, and then at least we can say it will affect our estimator basically to that degree compared to the uncertainty of the estimator itself. So we don't propagate them, but what we can test for is that their impact will be small compared to the uncertainties, and then we say it's safe to ignore them. That's basically the approach. But in terms of the sample averages and approximations that you saw, they were all taken as is, and there was no additional error propagation. All error propagation that we do, we try to incorporate into the approximation right away. So we basically go to the level where we say this is as far as we can go in terms of approximation, and every residual error is hopefully so small that it doesn't affect our estimators anymore. Questions? Yeah.
Yes. Someone who's worked in the EHG collaboration said he's broadly aware of the studies that have tried to reproduce the results. It's always nice to see if it works. I was just curious, this your reconstruction was solely based on the closure quantities, right? So did you try at all to do it with the whole data set that has the calibration uncertainties, but putting some prior information on it? Did you try that or
we tried, and we also have maybe I forgot to say that. So there is a sub part of our group doing traditional radio interferometry, not VLBI imaging, and the software package for this is Resolve, and it also has a self-call mode, and we've tried to work doing self-calibration, but we couldn't make it. To be honest, we couldn't make it work. We've tried, and we've also went back and forth. I know in the HT there was this start with closure only, then do calibration partially, and so on and so forth. We've also played around with these things, but in the end, we didn't manage to calibrate this data set. Maybe we were missing something. I don't know. We've also talked with a few of the people then after, but for us, it ended up being a closure-only reconstruction, which also meant that our absolute flux, for example, we just took the one that was reported from EHT, and our reconstructions are essentially unitless, so to say.
That's a good enough reconstruction. Also, it's accurate. People spend significant amount of time to understand telescope gains.
Yeah, no, it's a really tough problem. Also, so the person that has followed this up now, Jakob Knollmüller, he's still working in VLBI. I think he's now working with Heino Falke. So, and he's applying these things and has participated also a lot in the data challenges and in the upcoming things. So, maybe they've found a way, but so as far as I know, it's still mostly closure quantities, at least for our algorithm that work best.
Yeah.
One last but very quick, hopefully, question follow up by Vincent on the previous discussion.
Sorry, Vincent, I didn't even ask if I satisfied your.
So he asked us if the parameter space is deformed, how does this complicate the model comparison? If it has any impact, when, for example, using evidence.
So what we cannot compute evidences exactly. That's one of the issues, right? So the best we can do with variation inference is basically get an evidence lower bound or elbow to it, and essentially the moment you have deformed parameter spaces is the moment where your elbow is going to be only a lower bound. It cannot be, but the elbow can be exact if and only if your approximation is exact, essentially, and the effect on how off this elbow estimate is also depending on how non-linearly deformed your parameter space is. Hopefully nothing went wrong. No, so yes, essentially, I would say at the moment the only safe estimate that we can give, or that in general can be given with variational inference, is a lower bound to the evidence. And I think to get a more accurate evidence estimate, one has to resort to other techniques like nested sampling.
All right, so Philipp is going to be here the rest of the day to the end tomorrow. And before construction approaches, let's remove ourselves from the room. Thank Philipp again. Thank you. Thank you for the